Okay, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about instance methods as well as static methods or class methods. So to start, instance methods are something we're going to use all the time in the course, much more frequently than the second type of methods we'll see. Instance methods are methods that basically, I don't want to say they live on a particular instance, but they provide functionality that pertains to a single instance of, in our case, a student. Or when we talk about a singly linked list, we will define many instance methods on those particular instances. Think of, for example, when we're working with an array. If I make a new array, so let's just call this array, data equals, and I'm going to do this syntax and pass in some numbers. Here we go. So we now have our array called data. If I do something like data.push, this is a method that acts on the individual instance of the array, which is data. So an array is a pattern, and we can define individual array objects based off that pattern. And so this is one instance, and push is a single method. I was going to do something like sort, and then I realized that I made a sorted array. So we'll do push and push 20, how about 99? And there we go. Now we look at data and it's changed. So we work with instance methods all the time, or the rough idea of instance methods in JavaScript. So we're going to do the same thing now on our student. We're going to create a method or two methods that correspond to individual instances. So not things that work on the class level, but things that are relevant to individual instances. So for example, here's one called full name. Again, not very useful, but it returns a string. Your full name is, and then inside that string, we're adding in this dot first name and this dot last name. And again, this refers to the individual instance. So whoever is calling this, whether it's first student or second student, will get a different output, assuming that they have different first and last names. So if we go back, I'm going to add this method in right here. And now if I execute my code, I have first student and second student. If I try first student, oh, there's no grade for either of those. That's okay. But let's do first student dot, and now we call full name. And I need to, if I just leave it at this, it returns to me. It's basically saying, yes, I know there is a method called that, but if I want to execute it, there we go. Your full name is Cold Steel. If I do second student dot full name, I get your full name is Blue Steel. So these are silly examples of what we're doing here. When we get to a linked list, though, we will define a reverse instance method or a push instance method, things that will actually work on individual instances. For example, in the next section, here's our singly linked list class. We have our constructor, but then we have a push instance method, a shift, an unshift, a get, insert, what else? Reverse, remove. Those are all, and pop. Those are all individual instance methods that work on a single linked list. On a singly linked list. It's confusing. So we have to instantiate a linked list in order to use those. Just like if we're trying to pop from an array, we have to have an individual array to pop from. We don't just pop from nothing. We need an instance. So let's extend this class. Let's add in a different method that actually updates the value of one of these properties. So let's say in our school, students can only be late 3 times. So let's create a new property. What do we want to call this? Absences is too hard to spell. Let's just call it, at least in the US, we call them tardies. I don't know how universal that word is, but we're going to call it tardies, and it's going to be set to 0 whenever we create a new student. By default, they've never been late. But now we're going to have a method called markLate. And all that it does is it adds 1 to tardies. So we need to access this dot tardies, which is referencing the individual student, the instance, his or her tardies. And I'm just going to add 1 plus equal 1 like that. So that updates it. And then let's return a string, or we could just return the number of tardies, but let's return a string that says, let's do full name, this dot steal, this dot last name, this dot first name, this dot last name has been late. And then in here, let's add in the number of times, and we're not going to pluralize correctly or anything. We'll just say this dot tardies like that. So Blue Steel has been late 3 times. Okay, so if we save this now and we instantiate a new student, we're not using grade, so I guess I could pass one in here. So I'm in first grade or first year, and Blue is in second year. Now I'm going to run this code, And if we look at students now, so let's look at first student. Now, if I access mark late, I have a method available to me. And if I execute it, don't need to pass anything in. Cold Steel has been late 1 time. And if I look at first student dot tardies now, I should have earlier looked at it. It was 0. There we go, tardies 0. Let me make this a bit larger. I've now marked it, and I can do the same thing 1 more time. And how about 2 more times? So now I have been late 3 times. We don't have any logic in there. I mean, we could add in a little conditional to check. If it's greater than 3, then we expel you. So why don't we do that really quickly? So we'll add 1 to tardies, and then we'll just add a conditional. If this dot tardies is greater than or equal to 3, return you are expelled. So if I rerun my code, instantiate, or let's go back to first student and do mark late the first time, the second time, and now the third time, you are expelled. And every other time you're expelled. Okay, that's good enough for us. The last thing we'll talk about with an instance method is defining one that takes some sort of argument. Let's also add in an array here called scores. It will start as empty because there are no tests at the beginning when we create a student. But then we're going to create a method. And our first one, this will be super easy. We'll just call it add score. And it will take in a new score. And then we'll just do this dot, and what do we call it? This dot scores dot push score. So this will just add the score on to the end. Now, yes, you could access this directly, but we'll talk about that in a second. So this dot scores dot push, and then let's return this dot scores. So if I rerun my code, and I now look at, let's do second student this time. Second student dot scores, it's empty. And I could just do manually just push on from here. There's nothing stopping me from doing that, but it's more conventional to define a method that will do this to prevent, there's nothing stopping anybody from manually changing any of these properties. But the conventional way of writing a class is that you assume that a developer or somebody will use a method that you put there. So we're going to use this instead as our interface to the data, rather than we would ask someone not to directly change our data. Instead, go through some sort of method. So we have add score. So I'll do second student dot add score. And then in here, what do we want to add? Let's say the score is blue is pretty good. She gets a 92. And let's do one more, this time an 87. And now if we look at second student dot scores, you can see, well, we were returning it already, but we have 2 scores in there. So the last thing that I want to do is create something called calculate average, a method. And it doesn't need to take any arguments in, and it should return the average of the scores in the individual student's scores array. So we'll have this dot scores, and we're going to need to sum them all up, and then we'll need to divide them by the length of the array. So to calculate the sum of all the elements first, we could use reduce like this, and I'm going to make a separate variable here. So let's call this sum, and then we're going to return sum divided by this dot scores dot length. So this logic is just here to reduce. It's going to take each item, it's going to add it together and create a total. So each number in that this dot scores array, save that to the sum variable, and then we return sum divided by this dot scores dot length. Let's test it out. So first student dot scores, or no, wait, we wanted to use add score. So 98, and then I did poorly and I got a 76. And then I did, let's just leave it at those 2. It'll be easier to tell if it's working actually. So now if we do calculate average, there we go, 87. Now if I add a different score in, see, I do really well, I get 100. Now our average goes up, and we could round it and all of that. Okay, so all that I want to show here is the basics of defining a class with instance methods. So we can define a simple instance method that just returns a string using some properties. We can define one a little more complex that manipulates one of the existing properties on our instance. Or we can do something like calculate average, which is going to have a little more math in it. But the idea is that all of these operate on individual instances. So next, we'll take a brief look at creating a class method, which we won't do very often, but I should put it in here just because if we're talking about classes in ES 2015 at this point, I need to cover it. Okay, see you then.